In this video, we're going to be talking about trustee powers, and specifically, we're going to be looking at investment and the power of investment for trustees. So, trustees have four main powers, and the main one that I just mentioned is the power of investment, and that's what this video and probably the next couple of videos after this are going to be focused on. But they also have a few other different powers as well. So we've got the power to maintain, the power to advance, and other miscellaneous powers. But first of all, the trustee's power of investment. So the duty of care and the related duty to preserve the trust property mean that the trustees have both the power and the duty, unless otherwise provided within the trust instrument, to invest any trust property. So there is a duty to preserve the property, meaning trustees can invest any trust property unless otherwise provided within the trust instrument. So there is a power and a duty to invest the trust property. You cannot just sit with your hands in your pockets. You have to do something with the trust property. Now, as previously considered, the office of trustee places an onerous task on the person who accepts that office, and bound up with this set of obligations are duties in relation to the treatment of the trust fund. And thus far in my videos, we have seen negative obligations requiring the trustee not to act outside the terms of the trust, nor to treat the beneficiary or the trust property otherwise than in accordance with those terms. Now, a different context arises in relation to the investment of the trust fund. In that context, as we're going to see, there are positive obligations on the trustee to generate the best return on the property, which is reasonable in the circumstances. Now, the main source of the trustee's powers is the trust instrument, the will or deed of settlement by which the trust is created. So in other words, the main guidance on how to invest the trust property comes from the trust instrument, and the trust instrument will say specifically whether it has specific things in mind. However, it is open. If it is open, then you do have some freedom as the trustee to invest the trust property. Now, in some cases, one of the aims of the trust will be to keep property, such as a family home or shares in a private company, in family hands. In those cases, the powers may be restricted by the terms of the trust. So, one example where the trust instrument may dictate how property is to be invested is where the trust instrument says property is to be kept in the family. In such a situation, the trustee's powers of investment are restricted. The trust may also say where the trustee should not invest the money. For example, the trust instrument may say they do not want the trustee buying shares in tobacco, for example. In other cases, the principal aim of the settlor will be to provide income and capital to his or her family. Okay? Now, in that case, the trustee's overriding duty is to protect the value of the property and to maximise the income and capital growth for the benefit of both for the life tenants and those entitled to the capital when the property vests. For example, the trust may say they want the property invested for the benefit of their family. It is the trustee's duty in such a situation to protect the value of the property and maximise the income and capital growth. So sitting there doing nothing is not enough as a trustee. You have to actively ensure you're getting the best deal you can. Your investments must ensure they benefit all your beneficiaries, whether they are long-term or short-term. Now, it's also important that we distinguish between the meaning of income and capital growth as well. So income means the monetary return on the investment. So it is the income received from the investment itself. And capital is the money that isn't really yours until something is sold. So in other words, I would have to sell my investments, my shares, to make a return on my investment. In other words, to make a capital gain. So the investment of trust property, and we've got the Trustees Act 2000, which states that under section 3 subsection 1, subject to the provisions of this part, a trustee may make any kind of investment that he could make if he were absolutely entitled to the assets of the trust. So this provision is referred to in the legislation as the general power of investment. So this section says that the trustee can make any kind of investment as if he were entitled to the property himself. In other words, the trustees have the power to act as though they were the absolute owners of the trust properties themselves without any restrictions, unless there is some restriction included within the trust instrument itself. Now, it should be remembered that the trust instrument may impose restrictions on the trustees' powers to make investments, and financial regulations may in effect preclude certain types of investment by persons who are considered to be insufficiently expert to make them. And if you want to look a bit more into that, have a look at the Financial Services and Markets Act 2000 Part 1. Now, in creating a general power of investment, the Trustee Act 2000 also provides that the power is both in addition to anything set out in the trust instrument, but also capable of being excluded by any such trust instrument, and that's under Section 6 of the Trustee Act. Therefore, the settlor could preclude the trustee from making particular forms of investment or otherwise qualify the trustee's power of investment. This means that the trustee is presumed to be free to make any suitable investments in absence of any provision to the contrary. Now, Section 43 Section 4 subsection 3 of the Trustee Act says that the standard investment criteria in relation to a trust are the suitability to the trust of investments of the same kind as any particular investment proposed to be made or retained, and of that particular investment as an investment of that kind. So in other words, this means that the proposed investments must be suitable for a trust of that type that the trustees are managing. So it is presumed that the trustee would be liable for a breach of trust in the event that an unsuitable investment were made which caused loss to the trust. And we can see that from the case of Target Holdings and Redfern from 1996. Now, whether a particular investment is suitable will depend on the nature of the trust. So where the trust is a small family trust with a comparatively weak, they don't want to take much risk, for example, the investment to be made should be pretty safe. Whereas investments made in behalf of a trust fund created by two corporations who are expert in financial services, which is a not uncommon structure for highly leveraged hedge funds, for example, could be considerably more adventurous and will intend to take greater risks. Now, Section 4, subsection 3 says that the standard investment criteria in relation to a trust are the need for diversification of investments of the trust insofar as is appropriate to the circumstances of the trust. So the question as to the amount of diversification necessary is dependent on the nature of the trust. For example, a trust which requires the trustees to hold a single house on trust for the occupation of a named beneficiary does not require that the trustees make a range of investments. Rather, the trustees are impliedly precluded from making a range of investments. Secondly, a trust with only a small amount of capital could not afford to buy a large range of investments. So now it's important that I just talk about the portfolio theory here. And the portfolio theory is that if an investor invests in a number of investments in different markets, the impact of any individual market or investment suffering from a fall in value is balanced out by the investments made in other markets, which will not have suffered from that particular fall in value. So let us imagine a trust with a general power of investment. Now, if that trust was comprised of £10 million, diversification would require that the trustees do not simply invest in shares in a single company. And this is really what the Section 4, subsection 3b is really all about. It's about this portfolio theory. Okay, now equally, diversification would require that the trustees do not invest in a number of companies which all deal in the same market. So, for example, computer manufacturer, because if there was a fall in the market, then the entire value of the trust would fall. Therefore, diversification involves acquiring shares in a number of companies in a number of different markets. However, diversification would also require investment in a number of different types of investments. So, for example, bonds, derivatives, land, foreign exchange, and commodities, as well as shares. So that if there were a fall in the UK share market, then the investment in the other markets would balance out the fall in the trust investment in shares. The assumption is that in modern marketplaces, there will be volatility in all investment markets, and therefore this volatility, meaning that investments may increase or decrease greatly in value over comparatively short periods of time, carries with it the risk of investments falling in value. So if the trust instrument clearly requires that the trustee invest only in a limited form of investments, then the trustee would be in breach if she sought to diversify the trust instruments into any other forms of investment which were not permitted by the precise terms of the trust instrument. Although, do note that if the trustee believes that it would be illogical to invest in accordance with the terms of the trust, then he should seek a variation under the Variations of Trust Act 1958 or under Section 57 of the Trustee Act 1925. So then, under Section 4, subsection 3 of the Trustee Act, the trustees must have regard to this standard investment criteria whenever exercising their investment powers. That is, it is suggested, whether making new investments or considering their existing investments. So the standard investment criteria to which the trustees are to have regard comprise two core principles of prevailing investment theory, which relate first to the need to make suitable investments, and secondly to the need to diversify and maintain a diverse portfolio of investments to spread the fund's investment risk. Now, these criteria, which are fairly broad, must be borne in mind by the trustees when considering how to invest the trust property. They must also have regard to the trust instrument, which overrides Section 3, subsection 1. And it's also important to remember that the trust instrument will always prevail. This is the most important thing. If the trust instrument tells you to do one thing as a trustee, then you must listen to it. Okay? Now, by Section 5 of the Trustee Act 2000, trustees must also take professional advice unless they reasonably feel that such advice is unnecessary or inappropriate. They are not obliged to follow advice, but they must consider it. So as a trustee, you need to seek professional advice. Trustees are under a positive obligation to take professional advice on the investments which they propose to make on behalf of the trust. Now, under Section 5, subsection 1, before the trustees make any investment, they are required to seek, quote, proper advice. And this advice must be taken before the exercise of any investment powers. And similarly, under Section 5, subsection 2, when considering whether or not to vary the investments which the trust has made, the trustees are also required to take qualified investment advice unless it appears reasonable to the trustees in the circumstances to dispense with such advice. And the type of advice which the trustee must acquire is proper advice, and that means advice from someone whom the trustee reasonably believes is qualified to give such advice, and that can be seen in Section 5, subsection 4 of the Trustee Act. So that is the beginning of our discussion about trustee powers and particularly the investment of trust property. And in the next couple of videos, we're going to continue discussing the investment of trust property, such as like the types of investment that they can make and the specific duties of different things they have to disregard when they are investing trust property. But if you have any questions about this particular video, then please leave a comment below and I'll get straight back to you. If you enjoyed the video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel. Thank you very much for watching.